Today I want to talk about winemaking in Gaza, its history and its future, which might seem surprising as a choice of topic for a whole bunch of reasons. And yes, this is going to get political and ranty at some point. So if you're a little snowflakey, you can go watch one of the other 3 videos I'm putting up this week. So first, that topic, it might seem a little bit grotesque to be talking about wine, given the absolute nightmare which we're all currently witness to in Gaza. But the thing is, I think that disconnect of levels is actually a good reason. Wine is small. Wine is inconsequential. Wine is this kind of boring, quotidian, everyday thing which we can kind of more or less wrap our head around. By contrast, you see what's happening live streamed to us every day, things I hope never to see in my lifetime. When you see mothers holding crying, starving babies who they can't feed because they can't produce milk and because basic formula is under blockade. When you hear stories about reporters being bombed in their tents and then declared terrorists after the fact. When you see the smuggled out overhead footage of cities and towns just reduced to powder, it's kind of impossible to think about. It's like a wound in reality. It's something happening, really obviously happening, but which you can't really understand. But Gazan wine, this small, simple thing, which we can talk about and think about and understand, is very much connected to these events. And I think through analyzing little quotidian issues like this, maybe we can begin to orient ourselves with the larger ones. So I've been reading a lot about the history of Gazan wine, and one thing I've kind of discovered to my surprise is to the extent that Gaza wine goes in a particular direction, the rest of the world, the old world at least, tends to go in the same direction. The topic might also be surprising because, you could ask, well, is the area around Gaza even suitable for making wine or growing grapes at all? Isn't it really hot? Gaza is extremely hot, but look at where it is. Look at the climate. Look at the terrain, the soil, the latitude. If you basically go around the planet following the same latitude, you'll eventually hit the vineyards in northern Baja in Mexico, which are doing really well, to the extent that any vineyards in the world are doing well right now. Closer to home, of course, you have the wineries in coastal Lebanon and the Israeli coastal plains. They're right there. They're doing just fine. In Gaza, the sea is there. Sea moderates temperatures. There's lots of rolling hills, and where there are hills, there can be hillside vines. The soil's excellent. This is part of the cradle of civilization. So yeah, growing grapes there is, it's going to be a pain in the ass even in better political conditions. Because it's the kind of climate where the rain and the ocean breezes really have to do what you need them to do. But geographically, everything's in order. People can make wine there. And they have been making wine there for millennia. But you might well point to those political conditions, right, as another reason why this is a strange topic. Because even when the IDF isn't destroying all the agriculture and fencing in the population, isn't it true that you can't make or drink wine in Gaza? Well, in the recent past, people have done it anyways. In fact, it was stumbling on an article in the Asia Times from 2019 that kind of put me on this topic. And I'll get to that article in a little bit. But, it has been illegal under Hamas to import or produce or consume alcohol, which is by contrast to the Arab Palestinian community in the West Bank, on the other side of the region, who have a fairly thriving economy of spirits and beer and wine production, despite living under mild to sometimes very severe apartheid conditions. So yeah, Hamas legally forbids wine. That is true. Footnote. So now, you might hear that and say, well, there you go. Hamas is awful. They're terrible. And they shouldn't be in charge. And I'm personally inclined to agree with you. And opposing teetotaling is the least of their issues. Know who else agrees with you? Quite a lot of the Palestinians in Gaza. There's been a lot of anti-Hamas protests in Gaza, even after October 7th, which has generally not been a great time for Palestinians to be sort of congregating in groups. I don't want to overstate the point. Like Hamas is probably still seen as more legitimate than like the PA, but do understand that for Palestinians, having the right political leanings hasn't saved any of them from mass starvation or mortar shells or having their tents bombed. There's a reason why you never see Gazans walk up to the IDF and say, hey, I'm not with these guys. I hate Hamas. I love wine. Give me a break. Because, the people behind this don't care. If someone's a Palestinian Arab, and they're in the wrong place, that's all that matters. And to paraphrase our president, they'll either be moved somewhere else and they can't go back, or they'll be shot and killed and destroyed. Direct quote. Which, by the way, is a very good dictionary definition of ethnic cleansing. They're not even pretending. The people in charge of this are absolutely just deploying the language of ethnic cleansing. And if an increasing number of voices are also now calling this a genocide, it's because the Palestinians, they can't even leave the kill zone now, which kind of narrows down that list of options that Trump presented. I swear I'll get to wine in a second, but footnote to the footnote. If you're curious who really loves having Hamas in power, it's Benjamin Netanyahu and Likud and the Israeli right, who we now know were funneling money and support to Hamas for years. Even more recently, it's been passed around a little bit. One of Hamas's recent peace offers to Israel, it's included not just offering to return the remaining hostages, but offering to just step down from power outright. And Israel's ignored that offer. And so if you're confused by that response, wait, isn't that everything Israel has been fighting for, or what they said they've been fighting for, getting the hostages back and removing Hamas from power? Why wouldn't they take that deal? You have to consider that maybe they've been lying to us, because Hamas, and God forgive us, Hamas and the hostages are both useful as instrumental symbols to pre-justify whatever the Israeli far right wants to do. And you can see the effect anytime you want to have a conversation with this stuff with your dad, a normal person, so like a CNN-fed normie, because you can tell them the IDF is shooting people who are lining up for aid, and they're just going to say, but Hamas, but the hostages. And if you then say, yeah, but Israel is willing to starve its hostages, their own citizens, in order to hurt the Palestinians, they'll just say, if they don't say fake news, they'll just say something but Hamas is forcing Israel's hand. They're making Israel commit war crimes, those monsters. You just hit a brick wall, and I think that's the whole point. It's and I have had these conversations, so my frustration is real. But it's open season on civilians and medical professionals and journalists over there right now, and you can't even start that conversation. Anyhow, sorry, close footnote. To sum up, yes, it has been illegal to make or drink wine under Hamas. But people have done it anyways, and it gets more complicated. We'll get to that. And if you're mad that Hamas has been in charge, you can write an angry letter to Likud. Let's explore the history of this, because it's a very long and interesting history. Gaza, the city, It's in its current form. It's originally a Canaanite settlement, going back 4 millennia or so. And the Canaanites loved their wine. These are the guys who were instrumental in spreading winemaking to Egypt and parts of southern Europe. And they were doing it in Gaza too. Over the centuries, they didn't rule Gaza for very long. Over the centuries, past the Canaanites, Gaza was conquered and ruled by pretty much every Near Eastern empire of the time. So you had the Philistines. I have a list. The Philistines, the Egyptians a couple of times. The Israelites, the Assyrians had it. The Babylonians. They all got Gaza at some point. Then, important turning point, in 332 BCE, it was conquered by Macedonia under Alexander the Great. And in the period following that, it became this sort of major center of the Hellenic world. Because you had all these layers of ownership creating a mixing pot, right? You had the culture of all these ancient Near Eastern civilizations, plus the kind of Hellenic Greek culture brought in by Alexander and Macedonia, and then later Rome, and then Byzantium. And then you also have the culture of the local Bedouins, who were also settling, there. So skip forward a couple of centuries. By the 6th century CE, Gaza, and they had to rebuild it a couple of times, it seems to have become the most important economic and political center of that whole area. And they made wine. Oh, wow, did they make wine. Archaeological records suggest that most of the farming in Gaza and the wider area in ancient Palestine was basically subsistence. So that is to say that folks grew what they needed for themselves and for basic trading, plus some wine grapes on the side for fun. By the 6th century, you find dedicated wine grape vineyards. And they were there to support a huge worldwide trade in what was called Gaza wine, sweet Gaza sometimes. So a sweet, high-quality wine that had the reputation for shipping well, because shipping was tricky in those days. They didn't have refrigerated containers back then. These were basically the sherries and the Madeiras of their day. These were hugely in demand throughout the entire Old World. They were shipped in these specific kind of amphora, these jars called Gaza jars. And archaeologists have found remains of these things as far away as England. So this stuff got around. Now, in subsequent centuries, after the 6th century, this wine trade kind of died off. It ended. And farming mostly returned to subsistence. And for a long time, historians blame this on the Muslims, as you do. It was, you always blame everything on the Muslims. Because the Rashidun Caliphate did indeed take Gaza from the Byzantines in 1634. We'll get to that in a second. However, more recent research has noticed the collapse of Gazan winemaking actually happens a couple of decades before this. And it seems to have been tied to two other things that happened. First, some extreme weather events now called the Little Ice Age. And, the plague. The plague happened. Not the Black Death. Not the Black Death proper. That came later. Same bug, though, probably. This was the plague of Justinian and a couple of other waves of plague that happened during the same kind of period, which devastated the population of this area and the economy, and seems to basically destroy the Gazan wine trade because being a big trade city is kind of a problem when there's a pandemic on. A little more water. Anyhow, the Caliphate sieged and captured Gaza in 1634. I said. And they mostly kept the city intact and kept it as it was. And another footnote. Gaza is a sacred city for Muslims. You ever heard of the Hashemites? Kind of an important group family. Their ancestor, the Hashim, also the great grandfather of Muhammad, he's buried in Gaza. Anyway, under close footnote, under Islamic rule, wine for local consumption Wine production seems to have carried on pretty much as it had before the big rush, the big international trade. Just basically as stuff made for local consumption on the side by subsistence farmers. Muslims themselves, of course, generally aren't supposed to be making or consuming wine, but historically they've been extremely tolerant to their neighbors, in this case mostly Jews and Christians, following their own traditions, indulging basically how they wish, as long as they're not getting in trouble and they're paying their taxes and stuff. That seems to have been the case in Gaza as much as anywhere. And then you can fast forward a couple of centuries. I'm skipping a bunch of stuff. Trying to get this video done before I have to go pick up my daughter. Fast forward a couple of centuries. This basically seems to have held pretty steady despite Gaza changing hands a whole bunch of times between different caliphates. The Templars had it at one point. The Crusades happened. England had it for a hot second. The Mongols had it. The Mongols invaded Gaza. Yep. Egypt had it as well. So on during the Crusades, the medieval world. And over this whole time, basically regular folks, particularly Jews and Christians, seem to have just continued happily making their local wine. The Ottomans, so Turkey, they took over in 1516, and it's the end of Ottoman rule, briefly interrupted again by Egypt. Egypt comes into this a lot. It's the end of Ottoman rule that Palestine wine, including Gaza wine, gets interesting again. Now, so I have to be a little sneaky here. At this point in the kind of meager research that I could do, this was not an in-depth project. I was just finding what I could find. At this point, it gets tricky to disambiguate Palestinian wine overall from Gaza wine in particular. I mean, that's not even true for previous Gaza wine, because even the Gaza wine from back in the day would have featured grapes from outside what we would now call the Gaza Strip, right? You'd have gotten stuff from further inland. Anyways, during this period, Gaza was fairly small. But it did still play a role in winemaking. So I'm going to talk about mostly Palestinian wine more broadly. And Gaza would have been involved in that. Something really important happened in the 19th century that suddenly put Palestinian winemaking back on the map again. And that thing, I talked about this before, that thing was phylloxera. These little bugs that like to eat vine rootstock. And these little critters essentially ate through every vineyard in Europe, there's a couple of ways, but really starting in like the 1860s. And when all the grapevines in Europe were suddenly dead, that suddenly put Ottoman wine, including wine from Palestine and Gaza, in very, very high demand. So you had all these modest local wineries built up by the local Jews and Christians over the years, most of them still in operation today. Suddenly they found themselves supplying wine to the entire rest of the world, to the point that by 1903, so the turn of the 20th century, wine was Palestine's third largest export. It's true, phylloxera eventually hit the Ottoman territories as well, because that's what it did. But one of the really interesting things I found was that the so-called sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, and their kind of their non-Muslim winemakers, they were like some of the quickest and smartest responders to the crisis. Like, they were really good at dealing with phylloxera. Palestine in particular was one of the first places in the world to adapt what was eventually the standard solution, which is grafting wine vines onto American rootstock, which an idea that came from Texas of all places. So the folks in Palestine, the winemakers in Palestine, they knew what they were doing. Now, what ended this kind of second life of Palestinian and Gazan wine as this big global trade item, it was the British, with a lot of help from U.S. prohibition. But yeah, I mean, really, if you want some kind of big, unambiguous bad guy for all of this. All of this is still it's going on. One character that basically everyone hated, it's the British. During World War I, France, Britain, all their allies, they fought against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and their allies, including the Ottomans. The Allied powers at the time basically made a deal. They enlisted the help of the Arabs in Palestine, what we would just now call the Palestinians, against the Ottomans, who were currently in control of the territory, under the promise that after the fact the Arabs would get their own independent homeland afterwards. That was the deal. And then when England and France and their allies won, they essentially said, yeah, we didn't mean that, and then just divided up the old Ottoman territories among their own empires. And Britain got Palestine. So during this period of what was called mandatory Palestine under British mandate, there was effectively, Palestinian wine, Gazan wine died again as a kind of big global trade item. So you had, well, first of all, American Prohibition, which cut off just half the market. Because, again, I think most of Palestinian wine was being sold to Russia and America at that time. And just overall, the British Empire was never big on its colonial subjects having big old successful international businesses. They didn't like that kind of thing. So the effect of prohibition and the kind of policy changes was that the Palestinian wine industry then kind of toned back down. Like the wineries still stayed open, but they kind of shifted and reduced back to mainly making local fare. So you shift from like higher quality products for worldwide shipping to everywhere to just basically making mostly cheaper stuff for local consumption. And meanwhile, of course, there was all kinds of immigration of Arabs and Jews alike and other people into Palestine, and a whole big number of revolts and uprisings involving both. Up through World War II and afterwards, Arab and Jewish revolts continued, even as Britain began the process of winding down its empire. So a lot of you, I'm guessing, are going to be familiar with the history of this, and I'm just going to hit the high points because I had to get through this. I'm going to hit the high points. So in November 1947, the UN General Assembly came up with a plan to partition the entire Palestinian territory into two independent ethno-states, one Jewish and one Arab, plus a kind of special status for Jerusalem. And that would come into effect after the British left. This was basically the first draft of what we now call the two-state solution. The plan was, let's say, controversial, to say the least, but Britain went along with it. And going into the next year, as they basically refrained from intervening because they didn't care anymore, and eventually they just left altogether. Going into that next year, 1948, all hell broke loose. And I won't go into the full details of the 1948 war, but the result was basically Israel and Palestine as we know them today. So you had Jewish control of the territory promised to them in the UN partition plan, plus quite a lot more. And then the separate territories of the Gaza Strip, and then also the West Bank split off from that. The West Bank at the time was kind of basically annexed by Jordan, while the Gaza Strip was nominally controlled by a government set up by the Arab League, but basically it was Egypt in charge. It was Egypt, again, in charge of Gaza. And then they've sort of formalized that by the end of the 50s. So at the end of the 1948 war, you also had what the Palestinians call the Nakba, which is the forced depopulation of hundreds of thousands of Arabs from Israeli territories, sometimes into one of the Palestinian areas, sometimes in other countries, sometimes just elsewhere within Israel, but without right of return. And that's something to remember as a footnote, by the way, for Gaza. A lot of the Palestinians in Gaza they're not Gazan per se. they're refugees. They are and have been refugees for, nearly 8 decades, the better part of a century now. Like generations of refugee families. So basically, so far as I can tell, back to wine. Arab League and Egyptian rule of Gaza basically kept the same legal structures as the British mandate before it. So there were no real constraints on producing or consuming or wine or other alcohol, even if in practice, due to the modest size of the region and the constant pressures on its neighbors, and not to mention the kind of cultural mores among Muslims, this remained very local, very, very small scale. Christians in particular would have been making a fair bit of wine, if only for consumption of their families and neighbors, and they seem to have been free to do so. Fast forward a little bit more. Then you had June 1967, which is when Israel attacked Egypt and conquered Gaza, along with a range of other territories. Lots of details to talk about there. And basically placed the area under military governance. Although later on they kind of lateraled control to what is called the Israeli Civil Administration, which is within the Defense Ministry, though. So it moved from military governance to the Defense Ministry. And if you say, aren't those two very closely related? Yes, they are. The Defense Ministry still controls the West Bank to this day, by the way. I've had trouble finding information about winemaking in this period. So late 60s up through the 90s. I have to presume that private winemaking continued pretty much in the same way that it had for centuries. But it's pretty clear that Israeli military authorities did not have a light hand. They seized water resources and water-related infrastructure. Hard to grow grapes without water. Hard to make wine without water. Heavy restrictions on agricultural activities and movement and market access, sometimes confiscating land outright. Difficult conditions indeed to make decent wine, but people did it anyways. So, the 90s. First time Gazans, or I should say Palestinians in Gaza, gained any kind of autonomy was after the 1993 Oslo Accords, which is when the PLO took control of the region. And importantly, under the PLO, there was, again, no formal prohibition on alcohol. Your Muslim neighbors may give you the eye, but there was no actual prohibition. It was still considered, and of course it was considered bad form for Muslims to make or consume wine, but others were absolutely free to do so. And yes, by the way, there's quite a lot of Christian Palestinians in Gaza. I should have made a footnote of that at some point. Unlike in the West Bank, I couldn't find records of successful attempts to kind of bring winemaking up to commercial scale. But people were clearly making wine all the time. And unlike in the Israeli governance days, they had more agricultural freedom, more access to water, and so on. And in the next decade, all of this changed again, sort of, when Israel formally disengaged from the Gaza Strip in 2005, and then Hamas was elected to power in 2006. Although, again, keep in mind who was bankrolling them. And under Hamas, yes, alcohol in Gaza, including for non-Muslims, is indeed formally banned. And Hamas are really serious about their interdiction of imports when someone tries to sneak it in. For example, I've read a few press pieces about them destroying, imported alcohol. But it does get complicated, and that leads me to this Asia Times piece, which I'm going to link down below. So there's a bunch of old stories about secret winemaking in Gaza under Hamas. This was the one I found most interesting because at the end they actually asked someone in Hamas about it. And I found the response very interesting. And I'm going to quote, "Secret winemakers in Gaza generally manage to stay under the radar. They are aided by the fact that Palestinian law does not forbid the import or consumption of alcohol. These are rules which Hamas has nevertheless imposed." Araf Abu Sido, A legal consultant for the Hamas counter-narcotics unit in Gaza told Asia Times that, quote, "No one has been arrested for making wine at home or any other place for years," unquote. He insists, however, that deterring secret winemakers is a duty towards society. So it's entirely possible he's just lying, of course. That I can't see why he would, though. I don't know how that would make Hamas look good. But if not, essentially is saying, yes, home winemaking is illegal. Yes, we deter home winemakers. But we don't really bother to arrest people for this kind of stuff. So it's a little bit like what the U.S. was like under Prohibition. Yeah, you absolutely chase after, Elliot Ness goes after Al Capone and all that stuff. But the guy crushing grapes in his backyard, you're not going to bother with them. So yeah, they'll bust up. Hamas will bust up smuggled booze or scaled up production businesses if anyone got to that point. But they don't care about the small guys making wine at home, which that's not exactly permissive, right? Still not where I would be on this. But it's still a kind of looking the other way. But let's talk about those small fries, because this is the part that got to me. The article mentions 3 folks making wine in pre-pandemic Gaza. So 2019, this article. I read, in a small room in her home in the Gaza Strip, 49-year-old Joseph sits on the floor holding a knife with a plastic handle, which she uses to separate the good grapes from the bad and splice off the roots before placing the best ones in a metal bowl in preparation for squeezing. Joseph, mother of Joseph, says that she does not sell her alcohol. She makes it for her family and some close friends. Quote, "The holiday season calls for some wine with friends and family," she said. Explaining her method, Joseph says listen to this, she squeezes the grapes with her hands into a round filter. Quote, "After washing the grapes well, I squeeze them into a container, then I filter them and add some white cheese to accelerate the formation of bacteria and the fermentation," she said. So to me, that's really interesting. I've never heard of cheese used in winemaking before. I don't even know what kind of cheese this is. Some cheeses actually use yeast as part of their production. Bacteria is more common. So it clearly sounds like some kind of way to control the microbial environment. To get the kind of bacteria you want, maybe, but not the ones you don't. I don't know what's going on there, but I'm curious. So this goes on. Quote, she continues to describe the process to Asia Times while she pours the grape juice into a 20-liter wooden barrel linked to a 5-liter container that is half filled with water. Quote, "I close the barrel and the container tightly and leave it for 50 days so that the gases move from the barrel to the container," she said. After the wine is properly fermented, she uses a piece of cotton cloth to filter the liquid and pour it into bottles. Then she says it is ready to drink. So, 50-day fermentation in barrel with cheese, and the container that is effectively using the CO2 from the fermentation to lessen or slow down oxidization. I'm guessing that's what the container is doing. That sounds kind of awesome, honestly. A little terrifying. Totally different from any wine I can recall trying. Here's a second winemaker. 50-year-old Hana Ayash, pseudonym to protect his identity, considers himself an expert winemaker. He takes pride in his method of leaving the bad grapes in the mix. As he says, it helps the fermentation. That's interesting. He adds a spoonful of yeast to each 5 kilograms of grapes and closes the container using a balloon or medical gloves. I'm guessing maybe the bad grapes, I'm guessing they're doing something similar here as with the cheese. It's something about having them in there is controlling the microbial environment. I don't know how, though. Notice also they don't mention anything about him crushing the grapes after he adds the yeast, which I suspect means he's keeping them intact. So he's effectively doing, with his sealing the container, he's doing semi-carbonic maceration, which sounds awesome. So this continues. After 2 months, when the balloon fills with gas to the point of near explosion, he makes a small piercing to allow the gas to escape, then pours the wine into bottles. The wine can be stored up to 1 year, he says. Ayash says he prefers to work alone for fear of attracting the attention of the authorities. Again, you want to keep this stuff small scale. I also don't sell it, he added. The winemaker's favorite grapes for making wine come from the occupied West Bank city of Hebron, as its grapes are known for their extra sweetness. Ayash says they are unique in their shape and taste as they are grown at a high elevation rich in water. The past 12 years of Israeli siege have left him cut off from his favorite ingredient, so he must settle for local grapes grown in the Sheikh Ajlan area at the southwest edge of Gaza City. So one more winemaker. I think this is the youngest. Zaid Khoury, another pseudonym, uses a similar method to Ayash's to make his homemade wine, although he prefers to weed out the bad grapes like Joseph. His problems go beyond the strictures of Hamas. The price of grapes has risen to about $2 per kilogram. I think can do cheaper than that at Aldi. Making them a luxury in an economy devastated by years of siege. The economic situation in Gaza has greatly deteriorated, and the prices have risen a lot, Khoury told Asia Times. It's hard enough for a person to purchase the most basic necessities. I can barely afford to make enough wine for the year, he said. So these people, these winemakers, and they're winemakers, absolutely. They're making wine with cheese and surgical gloves. They're paying too much money for whatever grapes they can get a hold of, all at risk from the authorities, and they still do it. And it's a luxury for them. And I find that an extraordinary expression of human spirit. And this article is an amazing glimpse into that. And the thing is, I don't even know who these winemakers are. They don't give their names. I don't even know if they're still alive. We may not know for years or ever. Like, there are thousands of bodies in the rubble, and the rubble is being bulldozed over right now. There's no more. There's no official count for the deaths in Gaza anymore. Not really. The unofficial counts I've seen, they started around 300,000 people, and it's very good odds that among those thousands are a lot of people who once made homemade hooch for themselves, cheese wine for themselves and their neighbors and their loved ones. So that's all over. That's the past. You can't. There's no more vines in Gaza. They've all been destroyed. There's no more grapes. Everything's barricaded. This is all over. But we need to talk about the future. When this is all over, however it's all over, wine will be made in Gaza once again. I guarantee it. It's been made for thousands of years. It will be made there after this. So the driving question for me, the focusing question, maybe I can put it that way, is what will that wine be? One very real possibility, maybe the most likely one right now, is that Gaza wine will be resort wine. Resort wine. I'm not sure if you've ever experienced this, but sometimes when you go to a hotel or something, especially in Europe, they'll have their own wine brand, often made with their own grapes. You'll see the vineyard outside. And I've had a bunch of these over the years. And at a basic level, they're all pretty much the same. Typically, they're international grape varietals, whatever recognizable grape varietals they can get to grow wherever they are, which is usually way better suited to other grapes. And often they're very heavily finessed with fermentation choices, with oak, and so on, to kind of polish them and to make them more palatable to vacationers. And the wines I've had in this style, they're fine in my experience, but they're typically overpriced and just totally devoid of interesting character. And I highly suspect this is the kind of wine we will get in the decades after Netanyahu and Trump get what they want and, as Trump says, clean out Gaza of Gazans and refugees. There's already a few wineries in the area, that some of the kibbutzes outside Gaza and in the Gaza envelope, who I imagine would be very happy to expand in the strip proper. But honestly, I don't think that's where the land would go. they'd be in contention. But I don't think that's where the land would go. I think this Mediterranean beachside property and the hills behind it would go straight to the highest bidders, Israeli or otherwise. And they will want to make their money back, especially through tourism. I don't know if you remember that video that of Trump and Netanyahu and Elon Musk tanning out on the beach in a cleared out vacation nightmare version of Gaza. But yeah, something like that. So there will be resorts and hotels and kind of grotesque villas for the rich and some rather boring wine as well. The producers will probably even play up the ancient history. They'll mention all that kind of Byzantine stuff, the sweet Gaza that I mentioned, even if they're not going to mention the more recent history or who used to live there. But it's not the only possibility. It's not the only way this could go. In the last couple of decades, there has been a real surge of interest in research about indigenous Palestinian grape varietals and historic winemaking practices in the region from Palestinians as well as Israelis and others. Cremeson in the West Bank, for example, I had one of their brandies. Maybe I'll link that up down below. I don't think I said anything about Gaza in the process, but I'll link it up. They've really been focusing on native grapes in the last couple of years, and they're not alone. There's a ton of wineries in Israel and the West Bank, which, despite all the difficulties involved, they've been doing this kind of thing pretty successfully. Many of them, featuring Palestinians and Jews and others, kind of just working side by side. Annoyingly, almost none of this comes stateside, which is just... don't think I didn't look for like West Bank spirits or wine to enjoy while I was talking about all this stuff. Anyways, you could see the same thing in Gaza, right? If the Gaza area had sovereignty and access to international markets and didn't have to worry about the IDF, mowing the lawn, as they say, every so often, they could begin to scale up production, and that could include interesting and characterful Palestinian-owned wineries. Or, if the Gaza area were part of a single, multi-ethnic, truly democratic state with some kind of truth and reconciliation agenda. It's a solution that no one wants, but it might be the one that has a chance of happening. In that case, they could again begin to scale up production, and that could also include interesting and characterful Palestinian-owned wineries. Alternatively, there's the possibility that things just go back to how they were 6 years ago, or how things were, under the old PLO. It was so basically individuals and families sourcing grapes and making wine for themselves and their close communities. And you know what? That's fine. Because at least it's still Gazan wine made by the Gazans. And if I can be a little bit selfish, if I ever make it to Gaza one day, I'm much more interested in tasting, Hannah Ayesh's bad grapes wine or Joseph's cheese wine than anything coming out of a resort. So let me try to land this thing. So, as we all watch what's happening with horror and shock to the point where we don't know what to say, here's one simple, concrete question you might think about, among many others. What will Gazan wine be? Who will make it? Who will drink it? And once you have that question, once you've kind of wrapped your head around it, you can turn it around. Because someone critical could look at this video and say that I should just stay in my lane, right? Stay in your lane, Scott. I mean, they could say a lot of meaner things too, but they could surely ask, what the hell does this have to do with what your channel is about, with consumer advice and the international spirits market and all the stuff I usually talk about? And I would answer, it has everything to do with that. Because what I've found in researching this is that, you can tell the entire history of the old world through the wine of Gaza. All the ancient Near Eastern empires, Alexander, Rome, Plague, the Muslim conquest, the Crusades, the Mongols, colonialism, capitalism, the World Wars, even Cold War, the kind of Cold War era proxy wars. Because remember, in the 50s and 60s, when Egypt was in control of Gaza, they were very much aligned with the Soviet Union. And then, after that, you have this sort of quiet struggles of what we would now call neoliberalism. All of that goes through Gaza and its wine. And the lesson is this: where Gazan wine goes, so goes the rest of the world. So it's important to realize that the cleaning out of Gaza, to quote Trump again, along in a different way, along with the invasion of Ukraine, these are test cases. It doesn't stop with them. These are, if I can, the metaphor, and it's a terrible metaphor. The metaphor I can keep thinking of. These are the kind of Jurassic Park velociraptors of the world, jumping onto their fences to see whether they can break through. And if they break through, it's not going to stop there. And I don't just mean the West Bank or Israeli Palestinians. To the extent that this succeeds, it means that the new world logic is that powerful nations, whether backsliding democracies, if not like full-blown authoritarian states, the ones with tons of money and guns and influence, they can pretty much do whatever they want as long as they don't step on the toes of other such states. Which means international law, to the extent that we ever really had it, and I'm in that discussion, that it's well and truly dead. And that means the age of colonialism is back, baby, along with everything that comes with it, including mercantilism and an end to free trade, and including war when some of those toes do get stepped on. That's going to radically change a lot of things, which will include what's on your liquor store shelf. You can come up with your own scenarios of geopolitical gamesmanship and what the consequences might be. But what happens, for example, if the countries that have kind of recognized Palestine as a state, what if they watch this and they decide to go full-blown BDS, and then the U.S. slaps sanctions and tariffs on them, further sanctions and tariffs as punishment? What happens to your tequila, your Armagnac, and your Polish vodka? Point being, political disruption becomes market disruption, and you will see that at your local. And it's all starting here. So I'm making this video not to virtue signal, to express an opinion. Although, to be honest, I feel more freedom to talk now that pretty much everyone, everywhere you look, folks are starting to come around on this, finally. I don't even really mean to educate about Gaza's history with wine, although I think it's fascinating. I make this because I want you to think about where Gazan wine is going, because the rest of the world is going along with it. Because believe me, the echoes of Gaza, the echoes of what's happening in Gaza, they're going to hit you too. You're not going to feel those echoes the way that the Palestinians do. But one way or another, you're not going to be spared the consequences. You're involved in this too. Thanks for watching, and cheers.